with that, I'm going to introduce our first speaker today, and that is Lauren Brincat. Lauren is the curator of Preservation Long Island, a regional organization with a mission to celebrate and preserve Long Island's diverse cultural and architectural heritage through advocacy, education, and stewardship of historic sites and collections. Lauren has worked in New York museums and historical societies for over a decade, specializing in exhibition and program development, curation, and collections management. She is currently the co-president of the Long Island Museum Association and a member of the Museum Advocacy Committee of the Bone House Historical Society in Flushing, Queens, excuse me. She previously held positions at the New York Historical Society and the Museum of the City of New York. Lauren's current curatorial work emphasizes community and institutional collaboration across the region with initiatives such as the Jupiter Hammon Project and the Art of Edward Lang Project. Lauren holds a BA in History and Anthropology from the College of William and Mary and an MA from the University of Delaware's Winter Program in American Material Culture with a certificate in Museum Studies. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Lauren Brincat.
Thank you, Will, for that very kind introduction. And good morning, everyone. It's such an honor for me to be here with all of you this morning in our nation's capital to share the interwoven, multi-generational story of enslavement between Jupiter Hammon, the first published African-American poet, and the Lloyds that enslaved him and his family across early American history. This talk stems from work that Preservation Long Island is currently doing at Joseph Lloyd Manor, one of our historic house museums. The Jupiter Hammon Project, launched in 2019, is a community-centered initiative to reinterpret the house and to critically examine the history of the site as it relates to Long Island's legacies of enslavement and settler colonialism. And I am deeply appreciative of all of the descendants, community partners, colleagues, and scholars who have shaped and helped shape the story I am about to share with all of you today. But located on the ancestral homeland of the Matinicock people and completed between 1766 and 1767, Joseph Lloyd Manor is especially significant because it is where Jupiter Hammon was enslaved and authored some of his most important works that confront the social and moral conflicts of enslavement in the young United States. 3 essays and 6 poems by Hammon are known to us today, and in 2020, Joseph Lloyd Manor was designated a National Literary Landmark in his honor. So one day, as we were in the midst of the first phase of the Jupiter Hammon project, I got an exciting email from a descendant of the Lloyd family, who, inspired by the work we were doing to center the lives and voices of those enslaved at Joseph Lloyd Manor, offered to gift to us a collection of portraits that had descended in their family since the late 17th century. Thus prompted my exploration into the entangled lives of the Lloyd family and those they enslaved across generations, including Jupiter Hammon. During the 18th and early 19th centuries, generations of Lloyds were painted by some of the leading artists of their times, like John Smibert, John Wollaston, and Gilbert Stuart. Their portraits testaments to the family's wealth, status, and power. Unlike other expensive household furnishings like a mahogany tea table that was both functional and beautiful, or a silver tankard, which was both those things while also being literally made from money, portraits had little commercial value or real utility in the time period outside of a particular family. And I'm talking about around the moment that it's made. Through portraits then, the Lloyds, like other early American elites, sought to also present a continuous ancestral lineage to which they could link themselves and bequeath to succeeding generations. This intergenerational wealth and familial identity, however, cannot be removed from the dehumanizing system of chattel slavery that so benefited the Lloyds and others like them. A system that hinged upon denying enslaved people the very things their portraits were commissioned to represent. By the middle of the 1700s, New York held more people in bondage than any colony north of Maryland. And on Long Island, over 20% of the population was enslaved. In the course of our own research, we've identified the names of nearly 50 people the Lloyd family enslaved across the 18th century. And although our work has centered on Jupiter Hammon and his extended family, it is important to emphasize that he was part of a much larger community of enslaved people who forged kinship bonds, survived, and resisted in their own ways. The Lloyd family had initially cultivated its prominence and wealth in colonial America in late 17th century Boston, where James Lloyd I established himself as a merchant trader after migrating from Bristol, England, where his father served as the Lord Mayor. He was the third son. James solidified his affluence in 1676 when he married Grisel Sylvester of Shelter Island. Through marriage to Grisel, James gained ownership of a 3,000-acre peninsula located off the north shore of Long Island, referred to as Horse Neck, also called Comset by the indigenous Matinecock, who had stewarded its lands and waters for thousands of years. As colonization intensified in the late 1600s, the Matinecocks were dispossessed of much of their lands, but continued to maintain a presence in the region. In 1685, James received a royal title to Comset, making him the first lord of the manor of Queen's Village. Large manorial estates like Queen's Village were a really distinctive feature of landholding in colonial New York. They essentially functioned as independent governing bodies with all power vested in the lord. James and Grisel never actually moved to Queen's Village, but remained in Boston and leased out parcels of land to tenant farmers. And so that's what you're seeing here on this 1685 survey of the net. Through intermarriage, landed colonial families like the Lloyds and Sylvesters consolidated their wealth, status, and power. Grisel, James's wife, was the daughter of Nathaniel Sylvester, the first European to colonize Shelter Island, located between the north and south forks of Long Island's eastern end. Here, he established a provisioning plantation to supply the massive enslaved workforces in the West Indies with foodstuffs and raw materials. Nathaniel's brother, Constant Sylvester, operated 2 large sugar plantations in Barbados, from where Long Island's first enslaved people were brought to Shelter Island in the early 1650s. Among this group were Tomro and Oyo, the likely grandparents of Jupiter Hammon. The couple had survived capture from their West African homelands, the treacherous Atlantic crossing, and enslavement at the Sylvester's Barbadian sugar plantation before arriving at Sylvester Manor. On Shelter Island, Tomro and Oyo became part of a community of enslaved Africans and enslaved or indentured indigenous Manhasset, who, despite the brutalities of enslavement and settler colonialism, held on to their cultural identities, shared traditional practices, and created families. Archaeologists working at Sylvester Manor excavated this ceramic vessel from the plantation core, which blends indigenous design and materials with European style and West African firing techniques. Discarded as refuse and never intended to survive through history, this broken pot stands in as a different kind of portrait of the diverse peoples that came together at places like Sylvester Manor and Queen's Village. Evidence suggests that while enslaved on Shelter Island, Tomro and Oyo had at least 4 children, including a son named Obium, who is believed to be Jupiter Hammon's father. Legally regarded as movable property, the family enjoyed little security and was uprooted once again when Tomro, Oyo, Obium, and Tony were sold to James Lloyd in Boston for 83 pounds sterling to settle a debt. A year later, the family was indifferently torn apart when the Sylvesters repurchased Tomro and Oyo returning them to Shelter Island. The pain of separation was evident when, after the Lloyds relocated the teenage Obium to Boston, he stole a horse and technically himself in a bid to possibly reunite with his family. However, Obium was evidently recaptured and appears in later Lloyd family records. Following the death of James Lloyd in 1693, Obium was itemized in an inventory of the estate alongside a pallet bed, a chest of drawers, and old lumber, and valued at 30 pounds. For an enslaved person, the death of an enslaver often spelled uncertainty. At the time of James's passing, the surviving Lloyd children were not yet of age. Thus, Obium was bound out to various business associates in Newport, Rhode Island and Boston, including John Nelson, one of the executors of the estate. For some time, Nelson enslaved Obium at his expansive estate on Long Island, Massachusetts, not to be confused with Long Island, in the middle of Boston Harbor. The island may be seen through the window of the portrait executed by John Smibert in 1732. Nelson was nearly 80 years old when he sat for the influential painter who himself enslaved a Black man named Cuffy, who likely ground and mixed pigments for the in-demand artist. As art historian Jennifer Van Horn has demonstrated, Nelson's red mantle, ochre coat, and white skin were just as much the products of Cuffy's skilled labor as they were Smibert's. A century later, a descendant commissioned James Frothingham, a student of Gilbert Stuart, to paint their venerated ancestor, the copy that's now in preservation Long Island's collection. Sadly, we do not have the Smibert. Although Nelson's portrait presents a staid, noble countenance, his life was filled with unusual daring and enterprise. He was deeply invested in Acadian trade, spoke both French and Abenaki, led an uprising against the royal governor. He was imprisoned in Quebec and later the Bastille for privateering and espionage. A wild guy. By the late 1680s, Nelson ranked among the richest 6% of Boston's 1,500 adult white men. He had bolstered his position in Massachusetts society by marrying Elizabeth Taylor, the daughter of a close business associate and the niece of Massachusetts Governor William Staunton. Her portrait, also among those gifted to preservation Long Island, was likely done in Boston around 1685 to mark their marriage. Elizabeth's luxurious silk dress with fine lace trim, impressive jewelry made of pearls likely fished by enslaved laborers in the Caribbean, and pet squirrel on a gold chain reflect her wealth and discipline, and the family's connection to an international marketplace supported by enslavement. Obium was one of the many people the Nelsons enslaved either at their townhouses in downtown Boston or at their country estate on Long Island in Boston Harbor. In 1719, Margaret Nelson wrote, quote, "We got Will and Sam with much cost and trouble. Sambo we will sell and keep Will for his wife's sake." This may be the same Will who was assessed in a 1739 inventory of the Boston Long Island estate. Described as very old and listed alongside 4 other enslaved men, Jack, Boston, London, and Corydon. The inventory's passing reference to 2, quote, Negro beds itemized in the kitchen, just above pairs of iron chains, is a startling record of the horrifying brutality of enslavement in the colonial North. Elsewhere in the house, the inventory identifies 3 large family pictures, valued at 10 pounds each, the same amount the appraisers ascribed to Will, who, given his advanced age, was considered of lesser value. More than likely, these were the portraits of John Nelson, the one by Smibert, and Elizabeth Taylor Nelson, and another that is now lost. These pictures were located in a lower back room of the house that, based on the maps, prints, and case for papers itemized along with them, probably functioned as an office. It's possible that Will, or even Obium, caught glimpses of Elizabeth's portrait through an open door or while performing tasks around the house. Benefiting from the labors of their enslaved workforces, the Nelsons and Lloyds accumulated greater wealth and power that they continued to strengthen through kinship ties. In 1708, the two families merged when Rebecca Nelson, John and Elizabeth's daughter, married Henry, the eldest son of James Lloyd. Henry, like his father, was a merchant active in Boston and Newport and engaged with trade in the West Indies, where he maintained intimate and close ties. Henry's niece, Elizabeth Eastwick, was born in Jamaica and married Charles Apthorpe, a prosperous Boston merchant who was deeply invested in the trade and importation of enslaved people. In 1748, Long Island-born artist Robert Feeke painted both their portraits, the distant ship visible through the window of Charles's canvas, a symbol of his financial investments in Atlantic trade. Shortly following Rebecca Nelson and Henry Lloyd's marriage, John Nelson composed this letter to his new son-in-law, which he had delivered to him in Newport, Rhode Island by Obium, who was still legally considered the property of the Lloyd family. Nelson inquires about Henry's plans for his father's estate at Queens Village, apologizes for his delay in sending Obium, who apparently was reluctant to leave them, and provides patronizing advice for manipulating his behavior, saying, quote, "By praising and speaking well of him, you may do with him as you please, yet not trust him too much." The year prior, Henry had bought out his siblings' interests in Obium, who was then 34 years old, and over the course of 1709, Henry recorded in his surviving accounts the purchase of 4 other enslaved people: 12-year-old Nero, 16-year-old Bridget, 9-year-old Hannah, and Jack. Henry was clearly putting in motion his plan to relocate to the North Shore of Long Island, New York, where he'd operate the estate at Queens Village as a provisioning plantation like Sylvester Manor and take up his title as the second lord of the manor of Queens Village. By the early 18th century, as landed colonial elite looked to the broader Atlantic market to build their profits, Long Island became a major exporter of agricultural staples, often shipped via Boston or New York City to the Caribbean. Enslaved men and women performed most of this vital maritime and agricultural labor, significantly contributing to the region's economic development. At Queens Village, Henry's new enslaved workforce would cultivate the fields, tend the orchards and livestock, spin wool and flax, and carry out myriad other tasks. Ahead of the family's move to Long Island, Henry sent over Obium, Nero, and Jack, who likely performed the arduous labor of cutting, carting, and putting up the timbers to construct the first manor house, seen here, completed in 1711. On October 17th of that same year, Henry recorded in his ledger the birth of Jupiter, the son of Obium and possibly Rose, the grandson of Tom Roanoyo, and a baby boy he considered his property. Jupiter's classical name, a departure from the African ones of his father and grandparents, was likely bestowed upon him by his enslavers, disassociating the baby from a shared cultural identity and familial lineage. Between 1711 and 1744, Jupiter was one of approximately 20 children born into slavery at Queens Village. By 1730, colonial officials consolidated New York's numerous so-called slave codes into a punitive legal system that regulated every aspect of an enslaved person's life. Despite this, enslaved people attended religious and social gatherings, forged their own kinship ties, and asserted their identities. While enslaved by Henry Lloyd, Hammon authored his earliest known published work, An Evening Thought, Salvation by Christ, with Penitential Cries, on Christmas Day in 1760. He was 49 years old. Entries in Henry's ledgers, however, suggest that Jupiter was writing much earlier. In 1731, he purchased 2 sheets of paper, and in 1733, a Bible with Psalms. Hammon's deep Christian faith is reflected throughout his writings, and it's important to note that he was not the only one who was literate among those the Lloyds enslaved. A separate account documents Nero also purchasing a book with Psalms. There is also indication that Obium, Jupiter's father, was literate too, and likely passed on to his son another book with Psalms, and a devotion to reading and the oral recitation of religious verse, a tradition that can be traced back to West African storytellers or griots. Unfortunately, that book is now lost, but it is described in great detail in this late 19th century article and includes references to a series of inscriptions featuring the names of both Obium and Jupiter. Words, whether written, spoken, or sung, have played and continue to play a central role in West African history, politics, and religion. In colonial America, people of African descent, like Obium and Jupiter, retained their cultural heritage and resisted enslavement by incorporating African religious traditions into Christianity. It seems likely that Hammon was also a lay minister and that his poetry was intended to be recited or sung, perhaps accompanied by music performed by Michael Cox, an enslaved musician who read sheet music and played the violin. Although there were many laws in colonial New York that severely restricted the agency of enslaved people, it was not illegal to teach an enslaved person how to read or write, but was oftentimes encouraged for learning the Bible. The Lloyds were active in the Church of England and were also involved in the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Foreign Parts, an Anglican mission which supported the education of enslaved people in religion and elementary subjects. Furthermore, Henry's second wife, Mary, was deeply religious. And in 1750, her son, Ebenezer Pemberton Jr., published her devotional writings with an attached foreword that described her life and character, including her insistence that domestic servants, most of whom were enslaved, observed the Sabbath, a time she used to educate those around her. Mary Lloyd was present in Hammon's life throughout his young adulthood and likely played an instrumental role in his education and religious upbringing. Unlike other enslaved people who appear throughout Henry Lloyd's accounts, there are few records, if any, of Jupiter performing any sort of backbreaking work on the plantation, like threshing and fanning wheat or loading the sloop. This may be because he was simply physically unable. When Jupiter was only 18 years old, Dr. George Muirson treated him for a gouty rheumatic after experiencing severe pains in his legs, knees, and thighs descending to the bowels. And if the print on the left doesn't give you enough of an impression of how painfully debilitating this could be, I'm sure the one on the right does. Given Hammon's condition, the Lloyds probably only further encouraged his education, taking advantage of his literacy to assist with their business matters. Jupiter may have also had access to Henry's extensive library, which included books on subjects ranging from French grammar to world histories and the poetry of Virgil. The latter was likely the inspiration for Jupiter's last name. In classical mythology, the Romans considered the revered North African deity Ammon as an embodiment of Jupiter, referring to him as Jupiter Ammon or Hammon. The first documented use of the surname Hammon appears on Jupiter's first published work. Unfortunately, we'll never know if that was a nom de plume given to him by his enslavers to show off their erudition, or a name that Jupiter adopted for himself, embedded with powerful meaning. When Henry Lloyd died in 1763, the manor of Queen's Village was divided up among his 4 surviving sons, Henry, John, Joseph, and James, and this is the subdivision of the property. The eldest, Henry, received his father's manor house, while Joseph inherited his movable estate, which included the 52-year-old Jupiter Hammon. 4 years later, construction on Preservation Long Island's Joseph Lloyd Manor House was complete. It too built through the use of enslaved labor. The immense Georgian-style mansion, perched upon a hill, was a grand statement of Joseph's power, and the amount of wealth the family accumulated over the course of a single generation. Featuring a back hallway with staircase, myriad interior passageways, and small chambers with low ceilings, Joseph purposely designed this new dwelling to accommodate an enslaved workforce. Jupiter Hammon was one of approximately 10 to 15 people enslaved here at a single time. And that's a substantial number for colonial New York. The portrait of Hammon's former enslaver, Henry Lloyd, probably also moved to the new manor house. The same year the house was completed, Joseph's younger brother, James, who is on the right, a prominent Boston physician, commissioned New York artist John Mare to paint this version of their father's likeness after an original that John Wollaston had done from life in 1750. So this is the Mare copy from 1767 of an original 1750 Wollaston. James later wrote to Joseph at Queens Village requesting that he oversee the packing of the canvas for the transportation to Manhattan. Unfortunately, that original Wollaston is long gone. Near the end of James's life, he would sit for Gilbert Stuart, the leading artist of the New Republic, for his own portrait after a long and celebrated medical career. The Revolutionary War ultimately placed a strain on the four brothers. On June 13th, 1775, James wrote to Joseph and John, their other brother, cautioning against, quote, the many and great evils that attend a civil war, and encouraging them to, quote, consider well the justice and prudence of taking up arms against the parent state. Despite their brothers' warnings, John and Joseph supported independence. And following the crushing American defeat at the Battle of Long Island or Brooklyn, the entire region fell under British occupation, and Joseph fled to Connecticut along with Jupiter Hammon. Not too far from Joseph's house, the British erected Fort Franklin, which was intended to protect the area from attack from Connecticut. Loyalist refugees arrived in considerable numbers, and upwards of 800 people were stationed on the neck as defenders and woodcutters, more than half of them armed. The property sustained considerable damage, and the house itself likely played host to high-ranking officials. During this time, it's possible that Henry Lloyd's original Wollaston portrait was lost or destroyed. Jupiter Hammon continued to publish his poetry and prose while in exile in Connecticut. His earliest of them, an address to Phillis Wheatley, was printed as a broadside in Hartford in August of 1778. Through poetic verse, Hammon, who was more than 4 decades Wheatley's senior, celebrates their shared African heritage, Christian faith, and literary achievements, while also directly responding to her work. 5 years earlier, she had published her own volume of collected works, poems on various subjects, religious and moral, the first book by a Black American author. It is unknown if the internationally famed author ever responded to Hammon, but the two were actually closely connected through Hammon's enslaver, whose stepbrother, Ebenezer Pemberton Jr., personally knew Phillis Wheatley. Nevertheless, Hammon's engagement of a fellow Black American in a public philosophical exchange of ideas, particularly those surrounding enslavement, was an extraordinary act while a war for independence continued to rage on. Other works by Hammon, authored in exile and printed by a so-called alliance of friends, directly responded to the ongoing conflict. In particular, his dialogue entitled The Kind Master and Dutiful Servant reflects Hammon's anti-war sentiments and his complex feelings about the relationships between Britain and her colonies, God and humanity, and enslavers and the enslaved. Regarding the present war, Hammon wrote, quote, lay up the sword and drop the spear, a nation seek for peace, then shall we see the happy end, though still in some distress, that distant foes shall act like friends and leave their wickedness. From Hammon's perspective, the war brought unholy chaos and violence, which he experienced firsthand. Twice he'd have to flee invading British forces, first in New York on Long Island, and then Connecticut. In July of 1779, he was present for the siege of New Haven, which brought death and destruction to the city. At the time, Hammon was in the company of Joseph's niece, Sarah Lloyd Hillhouse. Her surviving letters document the trauma the war inflicted upon civilians. At 6 months pregnant, she evacuated New Haven along with Hammon, and later related to her aunt that, quote, old faithful Jupiter happened to be there, and he was a great comfort. Sadly, Sarah and her baby died in childbirth 3 months later. Her portrait, attributed to Ellen Sharples, is possibly a posthumous copy after one that had been done to celebrate her marriage earlier that year. Tragedy struck once again the following June, when Joseph Lloyd sadly died by suicide. The sermon, delivered by Reverend Perkins of Hartford, reflects on his passing, noting, quote, the distress of the times preyed much upon his spirits. On hearing of the surrender of Charleston, he gave up the cause for lost. The gloominess of the prospect seemed to overpower his mind. Jupiter Hammon was undoubtedly affected by the death and tragedy all around him that the war had brought. Without any heirs, Joseph bequeathed his entire estate to his nephew, John Lloyd II, the third generation of the Lloyd family to enslave the 68-year-old Jupiter Hammon. Following the war, John and Jupiter returned to Joseph's manor house in a state of disrepair. In this post-revolutionary period, Hammon authored some of his most significant and challenging writings, including an address to the Negroes in the state of New York, which he presented to the African Society, an activist group in New York City that advocated for the equal citizenship of Black New Yorkers. When Hammon penned his address in 1786, there were no emancipation laws in New York, but a growing anti-slavery movement. Drawing on his deep Christian faith and patriotic calls for liberty, despite Hammon's own criticisms of the war, he encouraged readers to seek personal redemption and to confront the moral conflicts of enslavement in the new nation. Although Hammon fervently desired liberty for the young, he expressed reservations about his own freedom. He goes as far as to say that he does not wish to be free. But Hammon, who was 75 years old, had survived 3 generations of enslavement and was well aware of what emancipation would look like for the elderly formerly enslaved in a society where no social safety net existed that could prevent or protect them from poverty and homelessness. While Hammon's address was republished twice, the poem he likely wrote along with it doesn't appear to have ever made it into print. Entitled An Essay on Slavery with Subscription to Divine Providence, Knowing God Rules Over All Things, it is the only working draft of Hammon's writing and his most overt denouncement of American chattel slavery, a sin, he declares, made by man. In it, he writes, quote, when shall we hear the joyful sound, echo the Christian shore, each humble voice with sounds resound, that slavery is no more. The fact that the poem may not have been published raises interesting questions about censorship and the influence the Lloyds may have had on Hammon's published writings. It is possible that an essay on slavery was too radical for John Lloyd to ever allow it to see the light of day. Despite Hammon's concerns about his personal freedom, he was probably freed by Amelia Lloyd, the widow of John Lloyd, sometime around 1794. Then, in his early 80s, Hammon found a home in nearby Huntington with his nephew, Benjamin Hammon, who was also recently manumitted, and Benjamin's wife, Phoebe. The small dwelling Benjamin and Phoebe purchased for $125 in 1799 is believed to be the first house in Huntington purchased by an African American. It is possible that Hammon helped supplement the young family's income by contributing the proceeds of a small orchard that the Lloyds had set aside for his personal use before the Revolutionary War. But only during his lifetime. Upon Hammon's death around 1805, Benjamin and Phoebe suffered not only a personal loss, but significant financial setback, as recorded in this document on the right. In 1821, Benjamin was forced to sell the house, being, quote, destitute of the means of support, and seek relief from the overseers of the poor of the town of Huntington. As these hardships demonstrate, Black Americans, young and old, encountered enormous obstacles to their advantage, to their advancement in the new republic. Since the Lloyds likely repossessed the orchard after Jupiter's death, the Hammons were denied the intergenerational wealth that so benefited their former enslavers. Meanwhile, Benjamin's generational contemporary, John Lloyd II, served as a United States Senator and was president of the Boston Manufacturing Company, a cotton textile business that operated one of the first factories in the United States. The growth of such mills ultimately fueling the expansion of enslavement in the South. In many ways, these historical disparities are emblematic of the wealth opportunities that have been denied to people of color across generations as the legacies of enslavement continue to undermine American society today. Despite the significance of Jupiter Hammon's story and his contributions to American history and literature, which I hope I've sufficiently demonstrated over the course of this past half hour, there are no known likenesses of the author. And I show this slide because if you Google Jupiter Hammon, the internet has decided that these are images of him. Not only did Jupiter Hammon die before the advent of photography, but these are two different men with their own stories worthy of recognition and celebration. On the left, Pyrrhus Conser, a formerly enslaved whaler from Southampton, New York, who in 1843 was aboard the Manhattan, the first American ship allowed entry into Tokyo Harbor after it rescued crews of stranded Japanese sailors. And on the right, Paul Lawrence Dunbar, the son of two formerly enslaved parents and an accomplished author in his own right. Unsurprisingly, there are very few depictions of non-white subjects created during Hammon's lifetime, and we get this question all the time. When a person of color did appear on canvas, it was often within a context that emphasized the racial supremacy of a white enslaver, such as John Trumbull's portrait of George Washington, which features a stereotypical representation of William Lee, his enslaved attendant, who at the edge of the canvas holds onto the horse, eyes fixed upon his enslaver. Phyllis Wheatley's portrait, however, is a rare sympathetic likeness, adhering to conventions more typically reserved for 18th century elite white sitters. Engraved in London in 1773, after a lost original, possibly painted in Boston by enslaved artists Scipio Moorhead or Prince Demma, Wheatley's portrait survives as the frontispiece to her poems in various subjects. Together, Hammon and Wheatley were the only enslaved authors in North America to publish their writings during the 18th century, defying a widely held racist beliefs in the intellectual and artistic inferiority of people of African descent. By confidently putting down on paper, composed by Jupiter Hammon in his own beautifully practiced hand, Hammon boldly asserted his humanity despite living within a structure that denied it existed. Although there are no likenesses of Hammon, his surviving words embody his identity and remind us that the Lloyd family portraits represent just one side of a story about kinship and bondage, survival and resistance across early American history. Thank you. Yeah, absolutely. So we are continuing to work on the reinterpretation at Joseph Lloyd Manor. So we're currently in the process of doing a bunch of dialogic workshops with community members. We rewrote the tour. We're also developing new school programming. So we have lots of ideas on how to continue make this research and work publicly accessible in different ways outside of our community and also within our community as well. Yeah. Yeah, so we are working, and so that's something we still really need to get into. So we started this project in the middle of the pandemic, so we couldn't really engage with people in person. And so that's something we're working with now and working with the local African American Historic Designation Council. We worked with members of the local NAACP. So there is a local Black church in Huntington that has ties to the early Black community here in Huntington. So those are things that we're working